Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here, and it's lovely to see you all this early Saturday morning, looking very perky. I wanted to start the discussion today by giving you a sense of where the idea for One Day Sculpture came from as a context for our discussion about the, if you like, the temporal turn in public sculpture and how we might understand public sculpture differently from conventional notions of monuments and commemorations. When thinking about what to say this morning, I was thinking about a Rosalind Krauss quote, a preeminent theorist and art historian who's written extensively about the nature of sculpture in the expanded field, as she calls it. And she talks about the logic of sculpture as being the same as that of the monument, in that in some ways it is commemorative, that it is about the representation of a particular moment, and it exists in a collective memory, if you like. And with that in mind, I wanted to just mention a work that I was involved with commissioning in Bristol in the UK in 2006, which began for me, as well as considerations of other work in this field, to enable me to think about what it would be like to commission a series of work that would only exist for 24 hours each. This work is by Ivan and Heather Morrison, a duo who live in Wales in the UK, and they wanted to produce a work that would launch the British Art Show, which is every 5 years is a survey of British art in the UK. They wanted to stage a work, an event which would exist only for a day, and they simulated a lorry crash in the centre of Bristol, which spread 25,000 flowers across the city centre. We installed it in the middle of the night, so as Bristolians woke up and walked across their city, the night shift workers came off work, they encountered this very odd, very stylised situation. And essentially what this was very clearly was that it wasn't a crash. It's the lorry itself is almost like a sculptural object. It's devoid of advertising. There was no blood, no glass on the ground, and clearly it was almost like a sort of cornucopia. And I sort of witnessed various people standing, waiting in the bus queue, bus drivers waiting to go on their shift, actually having conversations about whether or not this was art, whether or not this was sculpture, what was its purpose. And it was a very, very hot day, and as the day sort of went on, the tourists arrived, the whole thing began to wither. And so it then became this sort of rather sort of sad, in some ways, memento mori, as this thing changed and shifted throughout the day. At the end of the day, around 6 o'clock, being British, people queued up, and a queue formed, and then within 40 minutes, every single flower had gone. It was like a plague of locusts, and people took these huge bunches of flowers away. They took children out of buggies and put the flowers in the buggies and wheeled them across the city. They put them on their bicycles, and there was this incredible shift. This static object was dispersed across the city, and I walked through the city and saw countless times people going home with these huge smiles on their faces and these huge bunches of flowers. People would send in their phone images of these flowers at home, people they'd given them to. And so this thing became, it sort of changed from a sculptural object to an urban myth, to the moment, the day, if you like, the lorry crashed in Bristol, and these flowers were dispersed across the city. And it led me to think about the nature of what would a contemporary monument be? How did this work exist, not simply as an object, but as an idea in the public's imagination and social imagination? And this work has gone on to be a very different kind of work in different forms. These images are actually, I can't see them so well here, but they're very rich, large format images which have been turned into a tape slide piece by the artist, so it exists in another form as well now. And so I began to think about those works that for me couldn't simply be identified as performance or even participatory generosity projects. It seems to me that in this project, the artist had conceived of a work that changed and shifted with the duration of the day, and in some ways became a sort of portrait of Bristol itself. Now, you'll recognise this. This is yesterday, Roman Ondak's Good Feelings in Good Times, which again is a work for me which is curiously sculptural in form, commemorative, if you like, in the sense that there is a sense in which waiting or being present in front of a building or a particular place is sort of mimics that process, if you like, of being present in front of something, of stopping, of waiting, of thinking, of giving time to something. And as we watched this queue form around Wellington yesterday, in front of, yes, memorials and institutional spaces, but we also watched it in more ambient spaces, such as traffic islands and on the quayside here. I began to think about the nature of how this is a temporary sculptural form. And I love the fact that there are all of these different ideas and responses to it. So, for example, many of you in the audience I know went looking for it and couldn't find it. And so this sense in which that it's not sighted, it's not in one single place. It is an intervention and intrusion. How does that change our notion of who an audience is for this kind of work? This is a work that goes in search of its audience, if you like, as opposed to the other way around. And we might want to think about some of those ideas about a particular audience for work that is unannounced. Now, many of the artists who are in One Day Sculpture who've been invited to participate in this series, some of which may not be known to you, Javier Tellez, for example, who staged this remarkable event of firing a human cannonball over the US-Mexican border. Someone like Liz Allen, who will be known to you, I'm sure. Santiago Sierra, Kate Newby, all work in vastly different ways and approaches, some of whom will never have been to New Zealand before, some of whom are resident here. And I'm interested in that engagement with place and how we understand place to be. For me, commissioning an artist is about that moment at which you invite an artist to consider the context for their work. And I think one of the most interesting things that may result from this series is a range of different kinds of notions of place, both time and space, not simply location, if you like, Wellington as a mapped point on a Google map, but actually a place in which is constituted through people's responses, collective memory, all of those sorts of things. So One Day Sculpture will be a series of works, each of which will exist on its own day. There will be 24 projects which begin in June this year and run over the year to June next year. And each of which will exist in its, will be autonomous in its own sense. So it's not an exhibition of sorts because you won't be able to see them all together, but you will see them one after another. So that gives you a sort of context for some of the thinking behind this series of works and this commission.